Alrighty, folks, you're about to listen to a bonus huddle, a specially curated huddle that we run once a month with experts sharing their insights into the topics that are most important to our huddlers. Now, to this episode, which is indeed very special, we feature a conversation between myself and Peter Winick, the founder and CEO of Leveraging Thought Leadership. Obviously, the conversation was all about thought leadership and how you can take advantage of this marketing strategic approach. You'll also hear perhaps from some other huddlers because this was done in front of a live audience of subscribers to CMO Huddles. Okay, let's get to it. It is rare to see a B2B marketing plan that doesn't include some reference to thought leadership. We marketers use this term all the time as a noun, as a verb, as a strategy, as a tactic, so much so that it's kind of like the word marketing itself. It encompasses a lot. And in the process, I wonder if we've lost its meaning. But today we're going to solve for that. We will define what thought leadership is and what it isn't. We will assess both the strategies and tactics required to be a successful thought leader. We will show what great looks like and how you can measure your progress up the mountain. And I think it is a mountain. And to climb that mountain, I'm thrilled to welcome our world-class Sherpa, Peter Winick, the founder of Leveraging Thought Leadership. Peter is an expert advisor to individuals and corporations and is consistently ranked among the top global thought leaders and influencers in the world of thought leadership. He also co-hosts the #1 podcast for thought leadership with his business partner, Bill Sherman, called Leveraging Thought Leadership. Hello, Peter. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me today, Drew.
You know, I'm excited. I'm really excited that you're here. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. But at the same time, I'm not sure what it is right now. So I'm going to 10 words or less. What is thought leadership?
Yeah, so I'll give you the definition, but I think the key point here is I'm not a finance person, and most of us on this call aren't. But if we saw in our calendar invite a meeting on accounts receivable, we'd know what that means. And I think part of the problem with thought leadership today is at a macro level, nobody agrees on what it is. And then even inside of large organizations that have lots of people allegedly practicing some form of thought leadership, it's like the blind man and the elephant, right? So I think we can't always, or we probably can't have the world agree on our definition. But the first piece of advice I would give anyone is make sure when you're launching thought leadership initiatives, strategies, tactics, et cetera, in your organization, that you clearly define it. Now, I'll give you my definition, but you can choose a different one. The way I tend to define it is there's two pieces to it. There's the thoughtfulness and there's the leadership piece. So #1 under thoughtfulness, it's a bit self-explanatory, but maybe not, right? Like, what is it that you're putting out there that is not just regurgitating best practices or I already knew that or whatever? It's thoughtful. Thoughtful could come from research. Thoughtful can come from real life client engagements. Thoughtful could come from synthesizing different things in different fields. And then the leadership piece, I think, is the key piece. This is where you have the courage to lead the dialogue, to lead the conversation, to lead the discipline in a new and different direction. And it doesn't mean you need to be, contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, but you're adding and elevating the dialogue and the conversation.
Saying thoughtful, of course, plays right into the CATS framework, which has been canonized in the book Renegade Marketing. So, but when I look at thoughtful, I look at it from the perspective of what is it that you can do that will help your employees, your customers, and your prospects sort of in their lives, business lives or personal lives. Sure. So I look at thoughtful that way. Is that, am I bending the term away from where you're thinking about it?
Well, I think you're rightfully so looking at it through the lens of a marketer, right? So I think when you look at it through the lens of the marketer, sometimes you have to define it by what it's not. And I think in some instances, there's been an inflation of the title, and people that have been around content marketing for a long time, for some reason, thought leadership sounds sexier, so I'll do that. Well, there's a big distinct difference between content marketing, which is embedded into the sales cycle, and thought leadership, which is part of building your brand and building the sales cycle, but there's a little bit of a separation between church and state there. And then we also have,
I'm very interested in that. And I love to let's pull that apart a little bit. What is the difference between those two?
Yeah, so, well, I think there's three different buckets that thought leadership can be put in. There's content marketing, right? So if I was in the business of selling diapers to new moms, I would want to teach them things and tricks and strategies on how to not inflict diaper rash on the new one. That's great. Thought leadership, it isn't, right? So that's content marketing. No offense to the content marketers, but how does it really apply at the point of use or whatever the case may be to the specific product in question against the specific buyer or consumer avatar, or whatever the framework that we're using, right? Subject matter expertise is another area that gets potentially confused with thought leadership. You know, you might have people in your organization, depending on what you do, that have deep subject matter expertise on something that's not thought leadership, you know, refrigerated logistical trucking or something. Lots of people care about that. I don't think that's thought leadership. I think that's deep subject matter expertise. And it's not that one's better than the other. They're just different things. Thought leadership is, for example, you know, what are some people struggling with today? Well, large organizations are struggling with the Great Resignation. So thought leadership might be something that a human capital firm puts out about what's going on in, you know, what can you do to lower the odds of suffering from the Great Resignation? What are the things that others are doing? What are the, you know, how do you prevent it? How do you identify it before it becomes can we say pandemic anymore in your organization? Remember when going viral was like the goal of all marketers?
Yeah,
we need a new term, but anyway, it's a different world.
Why is it then, you know, I mean, I initially, when I was thinking about this conversation, I mean, let's face it, content marketing is hard enough to get right, but it feels like thought leadership is particularly hard to get right. And I just wonder, is it a strategic problem or a tactical issue or really both?
It could be both. So what I find often in thought leadership are lots of tactics deployed in search of a strategy to connect them together. So I look at it and say, like anything else, what's the objective, right? As a marketer, why am I making investments in this? What's the ROI? Who am I trying to influence to do what, right? And then it could be, I look at it as a continuum. There's elements of thought leadership that are about building your brand, that are about sort of differentiating yourself from the competition, that are around fighting commoditization, right? So these are high-level things that aren't measurable necessarily at the transactional level. Then on the other side of the continuum, and there's lots of stops in between, on the other side is, okay, how does it accelerate the sales process in a complex B2B sales as a use case example, right? Where, or in professional services, or in high tech, or in any of those sorts of things, how do we integrate it into the sales process all the way from a prospect checking us out to identifying a solution to getting in there so that by the time they're interacting, you know, with potentially a sales professional or whatever, thought leadership has done the job of you know, or done at least a good chunk of the job of a complex or consultative salesperson.
And so I immediately, as you're talking, thinking of Brent Adamson, who talks about reframing the conversation. So the problem that you're solving, they're thinking about in a completely different way than they did before. And when they think about it in a completely different way, then suddenly you're the only solution available. And so I'm imagining that that's part of it. But I guess I was wondering, so you see thought leadership as multiple solutions to multiple problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the Swiss Army knife for marketers, but it has multiple purposes and is absolutely a tool that should be in the tool shed, if you will.
Okay. All right. So it is a tool. We agree. It's and I know that just based on the attendance here, that there's a lot of interest in getting this right. And you have found on your website a interesting, and I love 4-component frameworks like CATS. Yours doesn't get to an acronym, but although I think we could call it ICOG. So let's go through, and those 4, just for folks, it's ideas, content, offerings, and platform. And I think it'd be really helpful if we go through these one at a time. So first, let's talk about ideas. What's critical here?
Well, actually, just one little nuance on that, Drew. If you notice in the graphic that we've got, strategy is underneath all of those, right? So strategy is the connective tissue to all of those 4 in the graphic there. But ideas are basically the core insights, right? It's getting someone to say, I see things a little bit differently. An idea done well can be articulated in maybe a sentence. And part of the problem with thought leadership is, it's easy for smart people to take simple things and make them unnecessarily complex, right? That's not really helpful as a marketer. It might be helpful in an academic setting or in a debate, or I don't know. But the real challenge is, how do you take something complex and make it simple, or make it universal, or make it sticky? So how do you get the core idea into a sentence or two? So that's sort of the idea piece.
And before we go on, let's just talk. Can you give an example of an idea that sort of ends up becoming a thought leadership program of significance?
I'll just use a tagline that I use selfishly for our organization, is that we have deep expertise in helping those with deep expertise. So that's on the side of our house that works with individual authors, thought leaders, speakers, and academics. So they've got deep expertise. And where do they go for help? Well, hello, that's what we try to point out. And they look at that and they go, oh, who's it not for, right? So there's a self-selection piece. That sounds like me. Maybe I should give them a call.
And so that becomes like a guiding principle for the way you go about creating thought leadership content.
Yeah, and I think another way to look at that is, when you look at thought leadership, and I'll just use individual thought leaders as an example, because organizations there's lots of different channels of thought leadership they can have. I call it the solve for X problem, right? So-and-so is known as the X guy. So in Drew's case, Drew is known as the Renegade Marketer, right? That's his solve for X, not Drew, blah, 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 marketing this, marketing that. It's Renegade Marketer. So Renegade means something distinct, right? And specific. He's not the boring marketer. He's not the, millennial marketer. It puts a stake in the ground as to what an expectation is when interacting with him or his organization or his work or his writing.
So in terms of the strategy behind ideas here, before we go away from that, because it's such a, it's a big word and there's a lot of things there, and we're not showing your chart, but we will share it later on. Talk a little bit about, how do we get there?
There's lots of ways to get there, right? So if we're thinking about it from an organizational standpoint, not from an individual standpoint, because there's individual thought leadership and then there's sort of organizational thought leadership, you get there by working backwards, by thinking about who are the avatars that you're trying to serve, because we can't be all things to all people, right? What are their pain points? And then what is it that you could be known for, should be known for, are known for, right? That you want to highlight. Sometimes it's the things that clients might be saying about you after the fact, in a good way, right? Oh yeah, they're the dependable creative folks, or they are like, how are you being described? What is it other than your professional savvy or accreditations or something? Why are they really working with you? Because, by the way, we've all been commoditized, and there's alternatives to every one of us here, right? In all of our organizations, what's the special sauce? And I think you use that as the basis to create it, and it has to be aligned with the brand.
Okay, so let's move on then. We've got ideas, and to me, the way you've said it is, it's almost, what's our point of view in the marketplace? What problem are we looking at, and what are we looking at it in a different way that is as both thoughtful and has some leading edge to it, I guess.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify on that. You can't force it. And I've seen some funny things over the years where certain companies, force thought leadership. So I remember seeing, as an example, Charmin had a Facebook users group, and I'm thinking, who the hell in there? Like, okay, great, big fan of Charmin. Like, nothing against Charmin. We all need it. We love it. We learned during the pandemic. But like, what the heck am I going to do with my time in Facebook? Like sharing, what would why? Like, what's the point here? And where that came to be was, a marketer somewhere said, oh, we need community. Yeah, we need community. How about a community of people that love Charmin? Like, how about that's a stupid idea? So I think when it comes to a lot of direct to consumer, highly transactional things, you can't force thought leadership into a place where it doesn't belong.
I don't know. It could be a lot to talk about in toilet paper land. So let's move on. We've got this core sort of thought-provoking idea that we want to get out there. Let's talk about well, content now. That is one of the four elements of your framework. What are we talking about
content,
here?
Yeah, so content is the entire library of everything in every format that's representative of the ideas. So this is where confusion happened, because we have so many choices today, right? And again, we have to be directed not by what we want, not by what we care about, but we have to meet the buyer where they are, meet them where they're going to be. And I think what happens is you see things that are just sort of comical, like, oh, somebody jumped on TikTok, but do I really want to see my dentist dancing? Like, does that really make me happy? So I think you have to have an understanding of too many people are in not enough forms of content. Like, hey, we're a consulting firm, so we write white papers. Guess what? Newsflash. People don't read white papers anymore for the most part, right? So if you're not in short form video, you're missing the market. If you think that because you're someone that reads a lot, that everybody else reads, check the data. The average person gets through 18 pages of the paltry 4 business books a year they write. So there's not a lot of reading going on. So I think the content is all the various places that your ideas can live and come to life. It could be, this is content, right? We're creating content right now, being a guest on a podcast, short form articles. It's infinite. And I think this is where people get the deer in the headlights problem.
And, one of the things that really makes me sort of crazy is when it's channel first, and right, where folks just say, hey, we want a podcast. And to help us get
That's a tactic in search of a strategy.
Okay. So what is if we back up and say, oh, we're going to do a thought leadership podcast, we're still kind of at a tactic. What would make that a strategy?
Well, a strategy is a strategy. So I would say we need a vehicle to connect with decision makers and develop relationships with them outside of the stress of a sales situation. Someone else might say, hey, a podcast would be good. Let's talk about the struggles and trials and tribulations of a chief revenue officer, because they're important to me. So I'm going to do this CRO of the future podcast, whatever. And I only want to talk to CROs that are of this size and growing, whatever it is. Oh, by the way, they happen to be my buyers. But now there's 2 calls I can make to someone. Hey, it's Peter. I'm trying to sell you a bunch of stuff. Click. Or, hey, it's Peter. I've got a leading podcast on blah, blah, blah that keeps you up at night. These are the other types of guests I've had. Would that be of interest to you? Guess which one's probably going to get answered at a higher level of probability.
So one question that came out is sort of this, and thank you for this one. Curious what % of content marketing you would categorize as thought leadership versus other? And I'm sure that varies, but when you think about it, thought leadership versus content, and since content is part of this thing, it could get confusing quickly. So let's simplify it. Is there a point where, from your perspective, thought leadership should be 50% of your content or all of your content?
No, so I think that's like saying what percentage of your ideas are your best ideas. So it can't be like, you can't say 80% of your stuff is thought leadership, because it's just not possible. I would think at a macro level, I would say maybe 5, 10, 15%. But I think the answer is different for everybody. So for example, we have a client that we're working with that is an electronic health records company. They have a chief medical officer who's deploying thought leadership, very targeted, very specific. All of the investments in that in that example is thought leadership, because content marketing doesn't work in that realm. So I think it depends on, you as marketers know who your clients and your prospects are, what worked with them. You have to do a little bit of a litmus test here and say, is this logical that this would work? How does this fit into the mix of other things that we have? And I'll give you, an example, Drew. Coming off of, I think we're almost done with COVID. I hope I'm not going to go there. But given that the last 2 years, one of the greatest A/B tests ever conducted for marketers was the absence of events, right? So we were all, as marketers, sending people to events, sponsoring events, whatever. And then we had forced on us the A/B test of what happens if we had a year, maybe 2, maybe 2.5 without it. And a lot of people looked and said, holy crap, what a waste of money that was. Intuitively, we knew it, but there was a fear of I'm Coke and Pepsi's there, or look at, CES in Las Vegas had 10% of the population there. So I think we've been arguing with our client organizations to say, listen, give us a little bit of that money you didn't spend on events and such, that, by the way, we know didn't always work as much as we'd like to, and let's run a series of experiments. Now, the hardest part about deploying thought leadership at the organizational level is you've got to play the long game. Like every marketer, we always want to think in campaigns, transactions, call to actions, et cetera. And there's a time and place to hold thought leadership to that standard, but you've got to be in the game for, in my opinion, at least 18 months before you can apply the heavy metrics to it. You got to set the stage. You got to set the case. You've got to constantly put great thought leadership out there. You can't write one article and say, oh, and to hire me, call. Like that just doesn't work.
Interesting. Okay. And I am thinking about that 18 months and it's certainly in my experience creating content, it's, the relentless consistency over time is what has helped. But I wonder, as I think about the CMOs listening, they don't have 18 months a lot of times for programs. That's a long payout.
So I think we did some research about 2 years ago where we interviewed 57 heads of thought leadership at global organizations. And the two big takeaways were you need very senior buy-in, that's called air cover, and you need a long-term horizon for it to work. And then there's a flywheel effect. So I'm not saying that over 18 months, it's all going to be money out the window with no impact. But if you can't sell that, hey, I need 18 months to do this, do not fall into the trap of, well, I'll settle for a campaign or two, because it's just not going to work. And it's going to make the case against you of, oh, well, we gave you a couple bucks here and we tried that Q3 of last year for an hour and a half or whatever. You're making the case to reject a longer term horizon.
So as I'm thinking about that, so if it's going to take 18 months to sort of build up the market credibility and really see this start to pay out, my thought is they're going to have a demand gen program that's working really well in the short term. That's probably content driven, or because events are off the table, and they're going to have that, and it's going to have to really do its job, which probably would have had to do anyway. So in order to give them what feels like a luxury, if I got to do something that's going to pay off in 18 months, I'm not saying it's, I personally believe in it, but I own my own company and I can budget for the long term. So that in most CMOs don't own the company, they don't have that luxury. So is that the biggest sort of hurdle to getting an effective thought leadership program in place, is simply that you have to sell in it. It's 18 months?
Well, again, you're going to see some hits along the way. If you can get your CEOs buy-in, even better. And if you can get them to participate in the process in some way, shape, or form. People always think of thought leadership, oh, it's a book, it's this or that. It's also the 5 bullet points that your CEO have in their jacket as they're walking over the hills in Davos from one dinner to the next. So the trick is, how do you use it to get the impact that your organization is looking for, right? So you're always looking for the quick hits. You're also looking for ways to conflate, when logical, business development and content development. Like the article example I gave you a little while ago. How do you get your CRO involved? How do you get your head of sales involved? How do you find a handful of sales folks that get it, your senior level enterprise sales folks that say, hey, let me talk to you about this, and where can I use this? Or here's a couple ideas that we can come together on to figure out how to use this to help you win the deal. And then, by the way, market the hell out of yourself. Like, look at the success we had with this thing.
So as I'm thinking about this and sort of equating it back to LinkedIn for a moment, the companies are rarely thought leaders, and individuals are thought leaders. And certainly on LinkedIn, that's the case, right? That you are much more likely. So as part of developing a thought leadership program is recognizing that there's a leader with thoughts here.
Well, I mean, that might be the Loch Ness Monster in some case, right? But I think there's a couple things to unpack there, Drew. Number one, putting all your eggs in one basket is risky. We've seen many, many cases where an organization made one person a rock star. Think Marcus Buckingham, think Chester Elton at OC10, or think more recently Burson at Deloitte, right? So when you put all your eggs in one basket, people do stupid things. People get inflated egos or sense of self-worth, or there's just a lack of alignment saying, listen, I don't want to be an employee for you. I go out and do my own thing and make 5 times the money. So I like the idea of institutionalizing the thought leadership. Now you have to have faces to it. So for example, AARP is one of our clients, and they have a huge thought leadership practice. They have 14 people in the department. They're able to specialize, have basically thought leader specialist based on the things that they focus on. So they have someone that focus on the use of technology to better age in place remotely. That's a niche. There's other things on health and wellness, other things on financial piece. So if any one of those people blow up or leave or decide to, be a yak farm or whatever, it's been institutionalized and you could replace that. Now, that being said, the other side is if you've got a founder that's a rock star, you have to look at what you've got. You have a Howard Schultz or a Michael Dell or a Mark Cuban. It's crazy not to use some of those assets if you have them, but you don't want to give someone leverage or create a situation where there's going to be friction or tension or a lack of alignment. You can put some of your eggs in that basket, but not all.
And it's interesting. And one of the strategies that many CMOs have employed is to sort of encourage their CEOs to get front and center and become thought leaders. And a lot of CMOs spend a lot of time behind the scenes making that happen. And that's an individual who obviously represents the company and has credibility and so forth. Is that problematic?
Anything could be problematic, but that seems to work fairly well I've seen instances where boards have pretty much told the CEO, you need to step up your game. The competitor's doing it and you're not. We don't have a point of view. We don't have a perspective. We're in, financial services or something else that's fairly competitive and commoditized. We better shake this up, right? And by the way, we're holding you to that. So whether that means a book or a stump speech or policy or whatever the case may be, I think it's high impact. And by the way, you have to, again, market that internally. So it shouldn't just be, the CEO has a couple of underlings running around as a speechwriter and a ghostwriter, whatever. How do you really push that in and out?
Interesting. And I've sort of veered off into a corner here, but I have to ask this question now. So several CMOs I would argue, are thought leaders certainly in this community, but also in general. Yeah. And there's a fine line that I've noticed that they walk where they're representing their company and they're helping their company look good and they're building their own personal brand. And there have been cases where, some CMOs have gone too far. What advice do you have for CMOs who are building their own thought leadership brand and how can they walk that fine line?
It's a great question. It's not just CMOs. So I think to me, it's all about alignment and fiduciary responsibility. So the reality is, it is transportable. So whether you're a CMO or a head of sales or whatever, it is important, at a certain level of the career to build out your thought leadership. Why? Because at a minimum, all else being equal, if I was going to hire Drew versus 2 other people, equally qualified, well, Drew comes with a book. Drew comes with a book, kind of getting all that that's at least, if not a deciding factor, at a minimum, a tipping point, right? The question is really about alignment. How do you make the case internally like, hey, I need to invest time, energy, and effort into my thought leadership, and here's the business case for it. It's not about me, not about getting the next job. Even if that might be bullet point number 11 that doesn't make it to the agenda, show them the ROI to them, show them the importance to them, show them how this is going to work for the organization. In some instances, we've had organizations that we've worked with say, you know what? We're just not invited to the dance. We're not invited to the cool parties. We don't even get to propose on cool stuff. We're perceived as what we used to be 10 years ago, which is a product company. And now we're, integrated services or something, but they still think of us as where our heritage is. Help us change that.
And I think it's interesting as you were talking about, I'm thinking about the CMOs who have done a really, really good job in building, I'll call it their personal brand as thought leaders. And they've done it in a couple of ways. One, if they're marketing to marketers, then it makes sense for the CMO to have a high profile because they're a CMO and they're a practitioner and they can do it. And there are a couple of CMOs who have built their personal brand by having a strong point of view about sort of building teams, for example, and just being a thought leader on what it means to be a leader.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and that's sort of, and it's very much about their own sort of personality and perspective, but it does accrue to the business and it accrues to the individual. You've
Yeah.
mentioned a book. Go ahead. So
Yeah.
go ahead,
Well,
Peter.
I was going to say I had a client several years ago who had a mid-sized PR firm, primarily in the West Coast, and what she was struggling with is managing millennials. So like 8, 10 years ago, by the way, a lot of people struggle with that. So she figured out, and the whole model in PR obviously is as the senior leadership, you sell the big deals and you push it down, you get the leverage on that, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you can't keep an army of 30 somethings employed, it doesn't work. Right. So she didn't see this as some sort of macro socio whatever problem. She's like, shoot, if I don't fix this problem, I'm out of luck. And I've seen 3 of my friends that are competitors go out of business because of this. So the outcome of what she did, and I won't get into all the details, is she wound up writing a book on leading and managing millennials. Right. It was just like, because people would tell her, she would go out and do some talks on it, like, oh my God, you've got to write this book. And it was like, wasn't the intent, wasn't the design. It was like, what is a real problem that you're trying to solve now? Who else, by the way, you're not the only one. Somebody else is probably staying up late at night today having a similar issue. And how could you help them by sharing that through thought leadership?
So we talked a little bit about CMOs helping CEOs build their, build
Yep.
themselves. And I know that there are several CMOs in CMO Huddles who have helped their CEO write books, right? Which is sort of a wonderful bonding way. We're going to make you look good. It's good for the company. It's good for the CEO. And it's really not bad for the CMO. But we also know that books can be very expensive business cards. Where do books fit into thought leadership today?
Yeah, I'll play my consultant card and say it depends, right? So there is no one size fits all. I think oftentimes what happened is there's a peer pressure. A CEO is tired of being at a board meeting or hanging out with other CEOs. Oh, you haven't written a book. You haven't written a book, right? Whatever. Oh, geez, I guess I got to write a book. So there's ego reasons, there's narcissistic reasons, whatever. A book is a heavy lift. And I think that sometimes people use books. I mean, we just had a client we convinced that we helped actually their CMO convince their CEO that the words he used were wrong. Yes, you said you want so-and-so to write a book. What you really mean is to build out a robust, multifaceted thought leadership platform, right? Because what are the goals for the book? Oh, I want it on the desk of every buyer. Okay, well, why do you want that? So let's play with that a little bit. So I think books are great, but it wouldn't be my first attempt at thought leadership because it's very expensive, long-term time horizon. The odds of it being commercially successful are like small. You've got to really get a lot of people behind it and be clear, what would success look like? What would it be? What does it look like if we hit it out of the park with this book a year from now? Right? Are we elevating the brand? Are we now being thought of at a tier 1 level of competitors versus tier 2? Is it what are the expected outcomes?
It seems to me, and a lot of these books come out when there is a vision to create a new category, for example, and they're so redefining the way people look at a particular industry, right? And saying we've got a new category.
If I see one more book on right now from a CEO or CMO on digital transformation, I may vomit.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's not new. That's followership, not leadership. So that wouldn't fit. Okay, so I do want to open the floor just in case if anybody has a question, wants to come on camera, just raise your hand. That would be awesome. Happy to have questions. I do see sort of there's a comment in chat where they said several companies have moved towards brand publishing as their thought leadership platform. And it's interesting that you mentioned Adobe and CMO.com, which was, I consider it was really something amazing. And now one might argue it's not. but it was at some point in time. How do you feel about that kind of, first of all, is that thought leadership, and what does it take for brands to do that well?
I think it was thought leadership, and I think it has, that specific example, degenerated closer to content marketing. And what happens is, if the promise is you're not going to market to me in this thing, it's really about thought leadership. It is so tempting to start drooling oh my God, we've got, look at the numbers. Look how many, we got to sell them something. We got to sell them something. We got to sell them something. Like, so as soon as you violate that, you can't get it back. Right. So I've seen lots of examples of smaller communities that are high impact, very exclusive, et cetera, that works really nicely. And I think making sure it's not, people are smart. People know when you're trying to infomercial them, and I think you have to give your buyers credit and say, you know what, are we sticking to the charter here? The charter is, this is a no sales zone. Now, we want to sell. We want to, marketing's job is to support sales, right? But in these sort of whatever sacred halls, if you will, of thought leadership, it doesn't happen here.
So in one way, we can distinguish thought leadership from, say, content marketing. And like in content marketing, you would produce a buyer's guide. You would produce which is not necessarily thought leadership. It's a buyer's guide. Here's the way to look at the category.
Features and benefits and blah,
right.
Blah, blah.
And you sort of, an FAQ, there's all sorts of sort of what we'll call sales enablement tools that could also fit under content. But thought leadership, by design, is literally to get you think differently about the problem that you're currently facing, and and with that insight that this company or this individual is offered on a consistent basis, get them to sort of say, I want to talk to these people. They have an expertise that I didn't. So it's an inbound strategy, right? You're trying to get people to sort of reach in. Okay. When it goes off the rails, when thought leadership doesn't work, what are usually the reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's several reasons. I mean, I alluded to it before, the lack of patience. Oh, we wrote one great article and nothing happened. Yeah, okay, well, nothing's going to happen, right? So lack of patience, lack of senior buy-in, leaning into the temptation of, well, just a little bit, it's like an ex-smoker trying, well, just one cigarette. And the next thing you know, they're, 3 packs a day. You can't violate, you have to have rules and say, this is how we will use the thought leadership in this way for these reasons. And this is what we won't do. Right. And I think it just, it's like scope creep. It happens. And you have to be really, really careful.
So there's this sort of, we have to have separation. As you said, we've got to sort of say thought leadership has a very specific role, and it's going to express a very clear point of view. Okay. So we talked a little bit about formats, and you mentioned long form content doesn't work anymore. And I want to challenge that for a second, because before I published Renegade Marketing, because the pandemic had started, we decided to publish a 15,000 word, what I call the mother of all blog posts on this brand process. And this still, we get 200 to 400 visitors a day who spend 3 or 4 minutes. You can't read the whole thing in 3 or 4 minutes, but they spend a lot of time with it. So is long form dead, or is it really just?
No, long form is not dead, but the data is such, the average business books, I mean, that's the longest form, right?
Right.
Sells 12 to 1,400 units. Think about that, right? Think about what it takes to do it. You'd be better off going to Starbucks every day, buying 10 random people a cup of coffee and talking to them. And within less time it takes to write a book, you could reach more people than that. Not only does it only sell 12 to 1,400 units, the average person gets through 18 pages. So long form is not dead, but I think we have to look at who is our buyer, what's their attention span, how deep do they want to go? If I'm selling very complex technical solutions, I'm going to read a technical paper, right? But the traditional, once a year, we put out our big white paper and it comes out in October and you have to constantly drip. This is where you take some of the best practices from content marketing: shorter, drip, multiple format. Now, there are times for a great white paper, right? But it's not the only tool. And I would argue that sometimes people have, why do you keep doing that white paper? Well, we've always done it. Okay. How's that working out?
I think the real point, though, that is that a lot of white papers are not interesting, one, so they don't pass you. They're not, yep. You can't get past page one because they're not worth reading. And two, they're not really truly thought leadership, but they're a sort of regurgitation. Right. So if we raise the bar and say, this is worth reading, because we do have a comment here said that long form is working better for technical audiences and international buyers. And so, I mean, I think if we're dealing with somebody who's taking an 18-month sales cycle and there are lots of people involved, there's a lot of room for both content that is long and well done and thought leadership, which is long and well done. But I think the bar is very high.
Yeah, I think the bar is high. And I think what happens is more, organizations that have been practicing thought leadership for a longer period of time, let's say professional services as an example, they are less apt to experiment with newer short forms. Oh, it's not on brand. It's not on this. It's not on that. And it's like, well, get over yourself. Guess what? Your clients are on LinkedIn and they do want to see a 2 to 3 minute video and read we're too smart to do a 500-word blog post. Really? I don't think so. Like if that's, think about the use case. 65% of users on LinkedIn are mobile. What does that mean, right? I'm not sitting here comfortably at my desk. I'm waiting online at Starbucks for my cappuccino, scrolling. 300 words is about the magic number. The Magna Carta, I'm not going to read, on my mobile waiting for a latte. It's not going to happen. I think we have to understand the way people consume today is so very, very different than it was even 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, no, and I agree. It's a mix, but part of this is it's additive, right? You need a perspective. First and foremost, to be a thought leader, you have to have a point of view. I think that's come loud and clear, and you have to consistently reinforce that point of view.
So the other thing I would say is big organizations, big professional services firms will literally spend millions on white papers when they're honest about the math, 3 FTEs and, whatever. I'm a big fan of being lazy and repurposing. So all that amazing stuff that was in the 48-page white paper, slice and dice that into smaller pieces, into graphics, into infographics, into short form, whatever, and reuse it. Because guess what? Even if I did skim through it, I don't remember, I read it 3 months ago. And if you're giving me a different version or iteration of it in a different modality, it feels fresh to me.
Right. Okay. What you're saying there is create one thing and then repurpose in all sorts of different ways. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I think this is an interesting thing. And this notion of convening discussions on a hot topic and maybe where you bring in lots of different viewpoints. And I'm curious if that, in your opinion, sort of provides a halo effect that has been helpful. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so I'll split that in two. So it is an effective tactic when done well to get the right people in the quote room or Zoom or whatever we're doing today and provide value. It isn't always thought leadership, but that's okay. Your version of thought leadership could be, Drew's the guy that always gets a smart room together on topics that are relevant to me. And that's important to me. And that's his value prop to me as a thought leader. It's not that what he says is not thought leadership. It's that plus he can put the right people in the right room talking about things that are topical and important and relevant to me. I think and by the way, it's easier to do that than to have to be the world's biggest expert on X consistently.
Yeah, it's much
easier.
Again,
lazy is good. I'm pro lazy.
It's easier to ask the questions, trust me, than it is to have the true point of view. And it's interesting, when the minute you talked about the convening, I'm just thinking of what Margaret Malloy has been doing consistently over at Siegel and Gale and how she convenes lots of folks for really interesting discussions. And I think it speaks to what their overall approach to thought leadership. Okay. So we started to get at things that where it goes off the rails, and I think we've covered that. Are there any other sort of success stories that you want to point to that will be enlightening to the CMOs who are at various stages with their content?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of success stories, right, in terms of achieving the objectives that you want your organizations to achieve. I mean, I think it just, depends on everybody's starting point and where you're going to go and try you're going to get there. Infosys does some amazing stuff. Accenture does some high quality stuff. AARP does a bunch of great stuff. I think in terms of achieving your objectives, there's countless. I mean, it's interesting to give you a sense of where thought leadership is going at a macro. We just partnered with the Stevie Awards, and there are now, I forgot how many, I don't know, 84 different categories where thought leadership for PR, for marketing, for communications, for sales, it's coming into its own. And I'm loving that, because I've been at this a long time, that it is maturing and being acknowledged and recognized as a discipline, a distinct discipline, not, it's a thing, or I don't know, it's charisma. I mean, it is a true discipline. It's still really, really early. Content marketing is only what, depending on how you define it. I mean, if you go back to Michelin guides, maybe longer, but not, it's old, but really not, in terms of the way we currently talk about it.
So interesting question that came out just a second ago on how many thought leadership narratives can you or should you successfully pursue? And I'm imagining if you're IBM, it could be a lot of narratives, but I think for let's just say a mid-size company,
I would flip that and say, how many avatars do you have?
How many?
You're trying to reach and influence.
As in personas, you mean? Yeah. Okay. So
I'll give you an example. I was talking yesterday to I don't want to give away names, but one of these scooter companies, the leading scooter company in Europe. They're in 187 different cities, right? And they just raised a ton of money through a SPAC, whatever. They need to influence three very, very distinct constituencies: regulatory at the local level to allow these scooters to litter your streets and you trip over them and whatever; the end user, why this is a good solution to transportation; and the industry at large, whatever that means, right? I have another potential client that is in the RFID space in Canada, right? And they have three or four very, very distinct avatars. So I think it's one narrative, maybe two per avatar, but you might have to influence as marketers very, very different groups. And it's not just the complexity of an IBM, but it depends on your business and what you're trying to achieve.
Got it. So speaking of what we're trying to achieve, measurement. I mean, we spend a lot of time in huddles talking about how we measure the success of things. And we've already said we need 18 months, but what's happening in 18 months that didn't happen in 6 months?
Well, so first off, you're going to track every micro success you can and broadcast and publish the heck out of it internally. Like whether that's an anecdote from the sales team. So you got to put the systems and processes in place. I'll back out of and then back into the measurement question. So I think as marketers, a lot of us have been seduced by vanity or faux metrics. And this is like, social media is a lot of those types of organizations are guilty of this. Ooh, look how many likes, look how many retweets. I'm like, okay, well, my goal is to, increase top line revenue 23% or to acquire net new client. Here's my goal. So that sounds like noise. Unless A is a predictive indicator to B, I don't want to hear it and don't call it data, right? So I think it is tempting and easy for thought leadership to borrow from social, the ineffective side of social, right? I like to come up with, and this is part of what we do for our organizational clients. Okay, well, what are the metrics here? How about if the thought leadership was mentioned in, a higher percentage of your diamond accounts this year than it was last year? How about if you got invited to 10 RFPs that you weren't invited to before? Ultimately, tracking of a net new client acquisition through thought leadership channels, that's the holy grail, right? Here's company X, didn't know we existed. They followed us here. They downloaded this. They did that. You should sort of track the progression, but you have to be looking at it every step of the way and say, well, what would success look like? And some of it is being comfortable with partial attribution, right? It's not like, listen, I download your white paper and I'm not going to get credit for a $100 million technology sale. So now we've limited the argument to it's somewhere between 1% and 99%, right? And I've seen a technology consulting firm actually have some really slick internal dashboards for long sales cycle, high complex, high touch complex sales that showed, they literally graphed along the sales cycle, how many touch points from how many different people in how many modalities on the buy side. And it was really, really interesting to watch that. And if it started to slip, earlier into the negotiation, it was an indication something's wrong. They've checked out. They're, they're seeing somebody else. What's going on? So you could, unfortunately, in many instances, you have to create your own sort of proprietary dashboard, which is hard to do.
So in many ways, these metrics are similar to metrics that you might have with regular content. So whatever attribution modeling you have there, you would do. And in some cases, it could also include, did someone else adopt that point of view, right? Did you got your point of view out there and that point of view started to resonate? And I'm just thinking about, in some ways, creating a new category is very much a thought leadership idea, right? And so when if you're the one who puts forward a new category and then suddenly the rest of the folks start using that idea, then one would say you've probably got some you've penetrated at least your industry. I don't know. Am I stretching it here?
No, I don't think you're stretching it, but I think most of us aren't looking to create a new category because it's so damn hard, right? What we're looking to do is be able to justify the investments that we're asking be made in thought leadership.
Okay. So is there a place where, firms come to you and say, we're thinking about thought leadership, and you say, no, you shouldn't do it?
Yeah, there's been a lot of direct, not that Charmin's calling us, but I don't really see a use case there that would make sense.
But a B2B brand, has a B2B brand come to you and you've just said, nah, I just don't see this as
no.
Something.
I mean, where it works incredibly well, high tech, B2B, financial services, a lot of nonprofits, mission driven, new category where you have to introduce. We're seeing a lot of stuff now in things like, edible cannabis, which is like, okay, well, the use case is we need to teach the Chardonnay mom that this is an alternative, as opposed to many of us have a preconceived notion of, oh, those are my stoner friends from high school. I'm not that. Like, okay, well, it's a different, well, how many bottles of Yellowtail you're putting away over a weekend, or hopefully Camus better than Yellowtail, right? Like, could it be a replacement for that? There's a place for thought leadership there to make a logical case, because the reason some folks don't, there's safety concerns and reputational and all that. So,
all right. Well, if edibles can do it, then any of the brands here can do it for sure. All right. Well, I think I have it's really fascinating, challenging area. Because it's challenging to be a leader, right? And this is not something that you enter in lightly. I love the fact that we're talking about it as a minimum of an 18-month thing, that you need organizational commitment. I love the fact that we look for small wins and we celebrate them internally as a way of marketing the marketing, which is great. Any final thoughts for the CMOs who are listening, who were thinking about this or want to kick it up a notch?
Yeah, and I would say, don't start with a tactical experiment. Start by making an investment in strategy to really, really think through. You spend a lot of time on your marketing plan. Organizations, we spend a lot of time on our budget, and we spend a lot of time on lots of things. Don't jump into this sort of herky-jerky, tactical, oh, I think let's start a podcast and then let's stop it 3 months later. Like, really put together a strategy that is not different than your marketing strategy. It's in essence in support of, an extension of, with the specialty and thought leadership would be, if you're thinking about, like, where the heck do I start? How do I even go about this?
I love it. We're right back to cats and having a courageous strategy to kick things off. All right, Peter Winick, thought leadership, leveraging thought leadership. Peter, where can people find you?
Yeah, sometimes my face is at the post office, but when it's not there, you can go to thoughtleadershipleverage.com, which is a website, and then LinkedIn, and the podcast, Leveraging Thought Leadership, and then you can email me directly, peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for joining us at this really amazing bonus huddle. Thanks, Peter.